Before the stone was released, before the giant fell, before a nation found its courage again, there was fear. A fear so deep that it silenced an army. A fear so heavy that even strong men dared not move. In a dry and dusty valley, under a sky filled with tension, two nations stood facing each other. On one side were the Israelites, tired and afraid. On the other side were the Philistines, proud, loud, and ready for war. And between them stood a challenge no one wanted to answer. This is the story of David and Goliath, a story of fear, courage, faith, and the power of God to use the person everyone else overlooks. This is David, a young shepherd boy from Bethlehem. He was humble, obedient, and brave. He had no armor, no sword, and no place among trained soldiers. But deep in his heart, David trusted God. This is Goliath, a giant Philistine warrior. He was fierce, proud, and terrifying. His armor shone like bronze fire, his spear looked impossible to carry, and his voice filled the valley with fear. This is King Saul, the king of Israel. He was tall, powerful, and chosen to lead, but the pressure of the battle had made his heart heavy. This is Jesse, David's father, a simple and wise man who sent his youngest son on what seemed like an ordinary errand. This is Eliab, David's oldest brother, a soldier in Israel's army. He was strong, serious, and quick to judge David when he arrived at the battlefield. These are the Israelite soldiers, men who had come ready for war but now stood trapped by fear. And these are the Philistine soldiers, bold and confident because their champion, Goliath, stood before them. In the Valley of Elah, fear had a voice. Every morning and every evening, Goliath stepped forward from the Philistine camp. His footsteps seemed to shake the ground. His shadow stretched across the dust like darkness. When he shouted, even brave soldiers stepped back. He called out to Israel and demanded that one man come and fight him. But no one answered. For 40 days, Goliath mocked Israel. For 40 days, he stood in the valley like an impossible problem. And for 40 days, the army of Israel ran from his voice. Not the strongest soldier, not the bravest warrior, not even King Saul. Fear had entered the camp, and it had made God's people forget the greatness of the Lord. Far away from the battlefield, in the quiet hills of Bethlehem, David watched over his father's sheep. He was not famous. He was not trained for battle. He was the youngest in his family, the one left behind while his older brothers went to war. But David was not weak. In the lonely fields, where no crowd was watching, David had learned courage. When a lion came for the sheep, David fought it. When a bear attacked the flock, David stood his ground. He protected what was placed in his care. And each time, David knew he was not alone. God had been with him in the wilderness. God had helped him when danger came close. God had given him strength when no one else could. So while others saw David as only a boy, God was preparing him in secret. One morning, Jesse sent David to the battlefield with food for his brothers. It seemed like a simple errand: bread, grain, cheese, and news from home. But sometimes the road to destiny begins with an ordinary assignment. David lifted the supplies and started his journey. He did not know that before the sun went down, a giant would fall. When David reached the Israelite camp, the soldiers were moving toward the battle line. The air was thick with dust. Tents shook in the wind. Shields clanged. Men shouted orders. Fear hung over the camp like a heavy cloud. David found his brothers among the soldiers. But before he could speak for long, a terrible voice rolled across the valley. Goliath had returned. The whole camp changed in a moment. Men who had stood tall stepped backward. Soldiers gripped their shields with trembling hands. Every eye turned toward the giant. David watched as Goliath insulted Israel again, mocking their army and challenging them to send a man. But what shocked David most was not the giant's size. It was the silence of God's people. No one stepped forward. No one answered. No one seemed to remember that Israel served the living God. David looked at the frightened soldiers, then back at the giant. In his heart, something rose stronger than fear. David did not see an impossible enemy. David saw a man defying the armies of God. And while everyone else wondered, How can we fight him? David's heart asked. How can we let him speak like this? David began to ask questions. He wanted to know why no one had faced Goliath. He wanted to know why fear had been allowed to rule the camp. But not everyone welcomed his courage. Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking and became angry. To Eliab, David was still the little brother from the sheep fields, too young, too small, and too inexperienced to speak among soldiers. David was accused of pride. He was treated like he did not belong. But David did not allow rejection to silence his faith. He had not come to show off. He had come to obey. And now that he had heard the giant insult the people of God, he could not pretend nothing was wrong. Sometimes the people closest to you may not recognize what God has placed inside you. They may only see your age, your background, your weakness, or your past. But God sees what he has been building in secret. Soon, word reached King Saul that a young shepherd boy was speaking with unusual boldness. David was brought before the king. Saul looked at David and saw what everyone else saw. A boy, no armor, no sword, no experience in war. Before Saul stood the greatest military problem in Israel. And standing in his tent was a shepherd who looked too small to solve it. Saul told David he could not fight Goliath. The giant had been a warrior since his youth, but David was only a young boy. To human eyes, Saul was right. David did not look qualified. But David was not trusting in how he looked. He remembered the lion. He remembered the bear. He remembered the lonely fields where danger came without warning. He remembered the moments when God delivered him before. David's confidence was not empty noise. It was built on memory. The same God who delivered him from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear would deliver him from the hand of the Philistine. That was David's faith. Not pride. Not foolish confidence. Faith. The kind of faith that remembers what God has done and trusts him for what is still ahead. Saul looked at David and saw something different in his eyes. Not fear. Not arrogance. Faith. At last Saul allowed him to go. Before David went to the battlefield, Saul gave him his armor. A bronze helmet was placed on David's head. Heavy armor was fastened around his body. A sword was placed in his hand. For a moment David looked like a soldier, but he could hardly move. The armor was too heavy. The sword was unfamiliar. The helmet did not fit. Everything about it belonged to someone else. David tried to walk, but he knew the truth. He could not win this battle by pretending to be Saul. He could not defeat Goliath by copying another man's strength. So David removed the armor. He laid down the sword. He stepped away from what looked powerful to others and returned to what God had already trained him to use. A sling, pouch, 5 smooth stones, and faith. David understood that God does not need you to become someone else before he can use you. He can use what is already in your hand. He can use the gift that looks small. He can use the skill developed in secret. David walked to a stream near the battlefield. For a short moment, the world became quiet. Water flowed over smooth stones. Dust moved gently in the wind. The valley waited. David knelt and reached into the stream. 1 stone, then another, then another. 5 smooth stones. To everyone else, they were ordinary. To David, they were enough. He placed them in his pouch and stood with his sling in hand. There was no crowd cheering him. No soldier walking beside him. No armor covering his body. But David was not alone. The God who had been with him in the fields was with him in the valley. And as David turned toward the battlefield, the valley became silent. A boy was walking out to face a giant. Every eye turned toward David. The soldiers of Israel watched from one side of the valley. The Philistines watched from the other. Some laughed. Some stared. Some could not believe what they were seeing. David looked small against the open battlefield. Small against the hills. Small against the armies. Small against the giant waiting ahead. But faith is not measured by size. Faith is measured by trust. Goliath saw David coming and was insulted. This was Israel's champion? A boy? No armor? No sword? No fear? The giant mocked him. He cursed him. He threatened him with death. But David did not turn back. Goliath came with sword, spear, and javelin. David came in the name of the Lord. Goliath trusted in his size. David trusted in God's power. Goliath believed the battle belonged to the strongest man. David knew the battle belonged to the Lord. The valley held its breath. Then the giant moved forward. Goliath charged with terrifying power. The ground shook beneath him. His armor clanged. His spear lifted high. His shadow moved across the dust like a storm. The Israelite soldiers watched in horror. But David did not run away. He ran forward. His hand reached into his pouch. His fingers found a stone. He placed it in the sling. The giant came closer. David began to swing. The sling moved faster and faster, cutting through the air. One boy, one stone, one moment. David released it. The stone flew through the valley with perfect aim. It struck Goliath in the forehead. The giant stopped. His strength vanished. His weapon fell. His body crashed to the ground, and the dust of the valley rose around him. For a moment no one spoke. The giant who had terrified an army was lying face down in the dust. Fear had fallen. Pride had fallen. The impossible had fallen. And David stood alive. Not because he was stronger. Not because he was bigger. Not because he had better weapons. But because God was with him. Then the silence broke. A shout rose from Israel. First it was small. Then it grew. Then the whole army cried out with joy. The soldiers who had hidden in fear now stood with courage. The men who had trembled now ran forward with strength. The Philistines panicked. Their champion was defeated. Their confidence was gone. Their giant had fallen. King Saul watched in amazement. Eliab stood speechless. The boy who had been overlooked had become the one God used to deliver a nation. But David did not stand in pride. He knew the victory was not his alone. He had brought the sling. He had thrown the stone. But God had won the battle. That day, Israel learned a lesson they would never forget. God does not need the strongest person to win the greatest victory. He needs a heart that trusts him. David's story is not just about a boy and a giant. It is about faith standing where fear once ruled. It is about trusting God when the problem looks too big. It is about stepping forward when everyone else steps back. The soldiers saw Goliath's height. David saw God's GR. The soldiers heard Goliath's threats. David remembered God's power. The soldiers believed the battle was impossible. David believed the battle belonged to the Lord. And that made all the difference. Everyone faces giants. Some giants are fear. Some giants are doubt. Some giants are rejection. Some giants are problems that look too large to overcome. They stand in front of us and say, "You cannot win. You are too small. You are too weak. You are not enough." But faith answers with a different voice. Faith says, "God is greater." David walked into the valley as a shepherd boy. He walked out as a witness of God's power. And his story still speaks today. When fear rises, remember David. When others doubt you, remember David. When the battle looks impossible, remember David. A giant may look strong, but no giant is stronger than God. When faith rises, giants fall. If this story inspired you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for more powerful Bible stories brought to life in beautiful 3D animation. And always remember, no giant is greater than God.